somebody mentioned just now, I see you've got a paper in there, and said, no, I'm a counsellor, I'm just here reflecting on a process or something that happened in 2012 when I worked in a domestic violence agency for a few months. The Duluth model is is the most common domestic violence perpetrator program in the world, and this is about my experience, but first a little context. In 2002 I divorced, sorry, I forgot to move the paper. That's me and my two children, and I was shocked how one minute I was seen by society as a loving father and next as a danger, and how accusations of domestic violence can change the dynamics in the family courts. After the dust has settled, I worked on the Families Need Fathers helpline for 5 years and trained as a counsellor. So in 2012, when I had a chance to work as a group facilitator, I jumped at it because I'd always been interested in working with men, but I had no idea it was the Duluth model at the time. The Duluth model, developed by late Ellen Pence and Michael Paymer in Duluth, Minnesota in the 1980s from work done in women's refuges. The power and control wheel was developed by Pence and Paymer from the common characteristics of the abusers that the women discussed. Oops, sorry, that's correct. The idea is to coordinate the response of police, courts and community-based organisations to end violence against women. Sounds like a good idea, working together. To hold batterers responsible and put them through a perpetrator group programme, where we all have to take responsibility for our actions. It's based on the theory of patriarchy that men feel entitled to control women and dominate them, intentionally using violence. Well, this theory of DV doesn't really make a sense from my experience of being a man, or the hundreds of men I've spoken to on the telephone helpline, or the men and women that I've worked with in counselling and primary care since then. So when I had a chance to work with this client group, I jumped at it because I wanted to work with people that fitted that description. I found the people in the agency wanted to help, just as I did. We worked there because we had a passion to help other people. But what bothered me was the Duluth handbook. The men in the group came from a broad social and ethnic background, and most were there because of social service referrals or court proceedings, often regarding their children. They reminded me of the men on the helpline feeling frustrated and powerless. The women were offered counselling and victim support, and the men counselling and referred to the perpetrator group. But do you know how I knew that the men were perpetrators and the women were victims? It said so on the assessment form where the name was labelled. So all the men were Mr. Perpetrator, all the women were Miss Victim, and there wasn't the other way round. The men had to acknowledge their violence and demonstrate a desire for change, even if their partners had been violent. Because women's violence in the Duluth model is only seen as a response to man's violence. So if a man says, or a woman says that I'm being violent to my man, well, he must have done something to you. The men had to attend 24 weeks of psychoeducation. Their partners were phoned on a regular basis and asked how he was behaving at home. And some had court reports sent to the court about their behaviour and work in the group. My misgivings as a therapist is that this isn't a therapeutic intervention. It's never purported to be a therapeutic intervention. It's all about changing men's behaviour by psychoeducation. There was no space to explore the men's issues or how they felt or look at the dynamics of their relationships, and I felt it was something that could have been done, could have actually made a difference. Some of the men had been violent, and some said that their partners were as violent as them, but there was quite a few that said, well, there's never been any violence, I'm not controlling. But the Duluth handbook implies that you're controlling and demeaning towards women. It's all about their behaviour towards women that they're trying to control them. The Duluth model seems to be a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't even consider gay and lesbian relationships, and the research suggests that perpetration rates are just as high, or if not higher. The men in the group represented a spectrum of different types of domestic violence, but Duluth is only based on coercive control violence, which research suggests is the least common type. It's based on evidence from a women's refuge in 1980s Minnesota, with no data collected from the men. But since then, there's been 35 years of research by people like Donald Dutton and Murray Strauss. So maybe it's time to ask a question about society's gender view of automatically framing men as dangerous and violent. So maybe you can ask yourself a question, but not say it out loud. I wonder if in your childhood men were socialised to control women, or men were socialised feeling a duty of care and respect for women. We have a pre-selected group of men here, so the data might not be representative, but neither is the evidence supporting the Duluth model. So my conclusions are that isn't it about time we looked at more up-to-date representative ways of understanding domestic violence and being more gender inclusive. Thank you.